Welcome to Beyond the Canopy, the podcast where we explore the most innovative approaches to ecosystem restoration and impact-driven investment. I'm your host, Alexander, and today we are focusing on what makes a high-quality reforestation project, how to build a productive forest and self-sustaining diverse ecosystem at the same time, and what are the metrics, market realities, but also the ethical values that differentiate a successful project from one that fails. And our guest today is a true pioneer in this field, Andreas Eke, co-founder of the Generation Forest, with over 3 decades of experience in Panama and other Latin American countries. Andreas has been at the forefront of developing solid models for tropical forestry that are both ecologically sound and economically viable. Andreas, welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. We have had many conversations, but I think it's actually also a great opportunity to focus and see how this exchange works.
It's great to have you here on the show, and it's for me also quite special moment for me personally. I want to quickly take the time for a little story because my career is very connected to your project and work. When I first visited Panama, this was about 17 years ago, and went to visit one of the first locations your wife and you planted. I think it was called Madera Fina in Las Lajas.
Yes.
So I was really remember coming from this dry, hot Pan American highway. Everything was dusty, and then I arrived in Las Lajas and went into this, relatively tiny couple of hectare forest, and it really blow me away because it was really as getting into a humid, much cooler, dense tropical forest. So of course I knew this wasn't a natural forest and not an old growth rainforest, but it felt a little bit like one. So the forests you are built are incredibly diverse and at the same time also engineered ecosystem. And this leads me to my first question. So some might provocatively call this a fake natural forest. Can you start by telling us about your journey to Panama and how you developed this concept of engineered naturalness?
Fake is a little maybe the word is a little bad, but the content
Strictly,
is not wrong.
yeah,
It is a human-made
yeah,
ecosystem, and as we know right now, humans have modified and moduled and created and changed Earth's surface to many, many degrees, mostly in a, with a result of degradation of the local environmental conditions. And so if we are able to create human-made systems on Earth, why shouldn't we also do this in a positive way? So I would not shy away to say that that person is right. It is not a natural forest. Even so, you have to be quite a specialist to understand the difference, right? The easiest to identify is, of course, the high number of valuable trees per hectare you have. Right? That's easy to identify. The others are pretty difficult to identify. And the journey is pretty easy. I mean, it's a long journey now, 30 years. We have our 30 years anniversary. And what we did in the beginning, Ilyana was working, and it was originally it's kind of symbolic for what we did. She was working on ecological research at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, which is potentially the world most important ecological, ecosystemic research they do now all over the world, but the headquarter is in Panama. And she did there on reproduction of native tree species. We have 3,000 tree species in Panama. So, and what she did, she studied the ecological elements of that, how they reproduce and all these details. And I was just young lost German in the tropics looking for things to do. And I encountered an old guy, Senor Balcevicius, I think from Estonia originally, and he started to plant teak and offered, El Tecal was the company's name, offered this as a retail investment to small investors, hectares by hectare. Today, I look at this and think it's a horrible business model, but at that time, I was fascinated. And basically, Ilyana and myself, we were looking at what to do. And we thought, and this will then influence the next 13 years of our work, is let's modify this teak monoculture plantation. So other people call this better practices. So let's stick to the system, but have better practices. And of course, the first better practice was let's introduce native tree species into this into the teak plantation, by that creating a higher biodiversity. This was very naive and was not scientific really, but it was just very thinking, how could we make this better? And then other things, we looked at the practices in the industry, and it was, for example, it was totally normal that field workers were not paying, they were not getting social security.
Yeah.
And so we looked at all these things and thought, well, we can make this a more social, impactful, or just socially like behaving, right? So it's not such a big impact if you just fulfill the law. But the industry did not fulfill the law. And until now, sadly, in many of the projects, workers work who are not covered by social security. So better practice plantations, that's what we were doing. Many years, we were then able to, this was very important, big US institutional investors to ask us to do this. We went to Nicaragua. We increased their native species as well. It was mostly teak, but also native species. And we learned the trade of forest investment, which we really before didn't know how things work if you invest. And with this lead investor at that time, we learned a lot on the investment side. And especially one thing was important. We looked at risk, because these investors came and say, we need an IRR of 12% in Panama and 14% in Nicaragua. And actually in Panama, we rejected their offer. We said, you cannot get this. But they
Okay.
liked that we did not take their money and just tried it. And then we worked with them in Nicaragua. So this was the whole initial, when this institutional investor went out and exited their forestry investment, we also went out this, and we had a chance to rethink everything. And
Yeah.
then the second phase basically started after that.
Okay. No, great. So, um, just comparing it from like a forestry perspective. On the one hand, you have like intensive plantations like teak or eucalyptus. On the other hand, you have conservation projects that just protect forests but don't use it. And your concept really sits in between and gets the best out of both sides. Yeah, so you have you create production, you create revenues that help the projects to sustain, and on the other hand, you try to mimic certain, yeah, ecological cycles from water, nutrients, distribution of different tree species in one plot, in one plot, right?
Um, what I believe is that we are talking about silviculture here, but you cannot only talk about silviculture, right? You need to talk about everything. And people often forget that sustainability has this other element people often forget, which is the economic side of it, right? So, um, and at that time, we already knew that we needed an enormous influx of funds into the tropical countries. And this has nothing to do with silviculture, but it has to do with the forest. So we looked at this systemically, said, okay, there is history, economy, actual policy of this time. And that package of things is like the society system, which creates the discount rate for a country. How high is the risk? And as you know, the discount rate is kind of the indicator for how high the risk in a country is. And then we looked at sustainable practices. And at that time, today it's different, but at that time, we understood that sustainable practices would reduce your profit. Let's take the
Mhm.
very simple thing. If you don't pay Social Security, you save that money and you get more, you have a higher profit. So many other things also in the field. We look at the field of natural forest management, right? So actually, my sister was working there with WWF in these fields, and we understood that the sustainable. I was using a very provocative term in this. I said, in reality, the only people who making a decent amount of return in tropical forestry are the illegal loggers. And why is that? Because they have a return which is higher than the discount rate. And
Right.
our question was, what could we do to reduce the risk for an investor so that the investor doesn't have a negative NPV in his project? And we looked at this, and what a surprise the outcome was. We cannot change anything in the society immediately. We knew we had only a few decades of time, and Nicaragua would not turn into, or in Panama not turn into whatever, a European country, Switzerland or whatever, with a very low discount rate. So what we could do is we could reduce the risk in the forest through a systemic approach. And this was, we looked at all the things which are reducing the risk. And I take one example, it's so childishly easy to understand, is we had the Audubon Society doing bird counts. So they count the number of bird species within 1 hour. And they did this parallel in a teak plantation in the neighborhood in our forest. They counted 2 bird species flying over the teak plantation and 52 living in our forest. And there is a risk of biological attack, of insect attack, which would reduce the surface of our leaves, and by that, the growth of the forest, of the trees. And in our case, we hardly have used insecticides because the birds were cleaning it up before. So we had an attack. 2 days later, we went there, and the insects were gone because the birds were eating the. If I have a monoculture plantation with no birds, the insects have a very good time, very long time, right?
Yeah.
Or you splash a lot of chemistry over it. So,
And this creates also additional costs. Yeah.
and this
So
creates additional cost. The birds
yeah.
are not on the payroll. So,
Yeah.
um, so the understanding was, and at the end, I mean, who wonders? But often you are in a process. Once the process is over, you look back at the process. We should have known this before. And of course, as more natural the mechanics and the what happened in the forest, as more natural it was, as lower the risk went.
Yeah.
And then we understood that actually on the profit side, on the positive side, there was one very simple thing to do, was to increase the number of trees which are usable per hectare. So if you look at this, maybe here you imagine on one side you have a natural forest, very biodiverse, 60 million years of evolution, can't really be wrong. And then on the other side, you have a monoculture plantation. If you put these two together, these two concepts, that's what a generational forest is. And we know that it is relatively easy to do this with fine tropical timber. And we can later speak about.
Yeah. Yeah. So Andreas, this kind of generation forest model is basically, yeah, a kind of invention or innovation you brought into the tropics. Because I think when I researched after my studies about interesting projects, this project was really the only one I could find during this time. So, however, when you so this could not be done everywhere. So not every degraded cattle field can be converted into a thriving generation forest. So what are your criteria for selecting the land?
Well, at the end, if we, and this is, I think this is very important. And for our sector and for the silvicultural people, the foresters, we need to open up, right? We need to look at all the other elements. And one thing we have encountered is this um, somehow rejections of the foresters are to look better on the soil. And you need to look at the soil. And so in the tropics, we have very big percentages of soil which are forest vocation soils. And this is not good. This doesn't mean it's good for a forest. It means that the soil needs the forest. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture has classified the um, the soils, and the last two are forest vocation soils. So we need to look at all the elements, and um, yes, we can actually restore all of them, also very degraded land. And we did that actually. We worked for a mining company. We built a restoration project on highly degraded land. And it was horrible to see because after 4 years, the trees were not reaching 1 meter. But nature can, you need a lot of, need a lot of time and more patient and more money as well to do this. And this shows the cost we will one day bear for degrading this land so much. We have a goal to be productive in terms of biomass increase to capture carbon, and also in terms of being productive in timber production, and also being productive by creating a high biodiversity and other elements which are going better and easier and less costly as less degraded the soil is. And we know very well where we stopped. I can you show you for our the Green Panama Canal project. Now we looked at 60,000 hectares in the region, and only 4,500 hectares were suitable, right?
Right.
So you can have an idea of what that means.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so you have described a little bit the kind of forest you're creating. On the one hand, so biodiverse, productive, social, and however, there are risks like climate, social, political risks, market risks, financial risks. Um, so how do these, let's say, more diverse generation forests handle this risk in a different way? So if we think about fire, droughts, flooding, so where do they behave different, maybe from a teak plantation or eucalyptus plantation?
Well, let's say if you compare it with a monoculture plantation, the monoculture plantation, at least in the first production cycle, is more productive as all plants have light or get sunlight. So you would get an IRR, let's say in Panama today, you could reach 10% IRR with um with a teak plantation, and only with the forest, only with the timber, you could get something like 7.5% from maybe 8% from native species. You have 250 basis points lower return. And but we believe, and we have to say, there is much more research to be done in the future. We don't know yet, but we believe, that's why I say believing, and we observe, of course, that these 250 basis points are compensated through a much lower risk. The risks have been lowered a lot. And especially if you zoom out in the risk and talk not only on the on-site risk, but on the overall societal risk. For example, if big monoculture plantation continue to degrade soil, or our forest rebuild the soil in the area. So the risk you mentioned, basically in all of the risks, we have much better performance, much lower risk, right? Of course, the external risk is the same. So the source of fire, for example, for a teak plantation would be the same. Maybe not totally the same, because as a social enterprise, the local around us, they know that they are well treated. We're good to work for. And they always, if there's a fire, like the whole community comes and wants to help. We actually put them back because of security reasons, but of safety reasons. But the fire comes from outside. But a fire going into, for example, we have a big understory. After 3 to 4 years, we let the understory grow. And even in a dry season, the understory is green. And if you look at how the fire moves into a monoculture plantation, it just races through it, right? In our case, really the understory stops. The humidity in the understory stops the fire. The fire goes further, but much slower. And of course, as you know, in forest fires, time is a very important factor. As more time I have to intervene, and of course, we have a good system in place. Actually, now we are using this satellites on fire service to get a notice if there's fire in one of our sites. So basically, all risks are considerably lower. And then, of course, some people say, well, anyway, we have thousands of hectares of monoculture and we have very little incidents, right? And that is also true because we know that the chemical side can control a lot of the damage. But then the question is, do we want the chemicals forever going into the water, going into the field?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then if you have a damage, then the damage mostly is very often like pest-like event. And if I have a pest-like event where 60-70% of the population is gone, if it's 60-70% of all you have or of 1/6 or something you have, because
Yeah.
we're using 5 to 6 species.
Yeah. So diversifying the tree species. So it's also a way of building a portfolio for risk hedging, right? So that's the one thing, and maybe also to comment on pesticides and herbicides that been used in plantation. These are things that also have to be put out by people, by local people, by your employees. And I think there's also a big responsibility to run yeah, a natural mixed forest diverse plantation in a responsible way. Um, so my question now goes into the direction. So if, let's say, the risks are managed well, so of course always can something happen, and it's a long-term investment. Forestry is still considered a quite stable investment and is used in bigger investment portfolios also to hedge other risks which you might have on the stock market or volatilities of the market. That for sure. But now, if you compare a plantation model, economic model to your model, so plantation you build up, then you do a clear cut. In your case, you build up a forest that becomes a generation forest. Can you run us a little bit about through these economic models so that in a funder really understand what's how the returns come back through thinnings? So how are the value streams built up over time?
Well, first of all, I want to praise the plantations because we often have these two camps, the people who want to preserve and the animals and nature and Pachamama. And then you have the other people who want to do development, economic progress, create productive projects. And I think the task is, even up to, I would say, political task, is that these separations of humans into these crazy, often fanatic groups, we should overcome it. And also in the case of the forestry, we basically need to transition from a non-sustainable model to a really sustainable model. And so if you do that, that I think is um, our main task
Yeah.
in this. And in terms of finance, what we have done the first carbon transaction B2B. We believe actually worldwide, we haven't found an earlier. In 1998, we did our first carbon transaction. So I'm really a big favor of the carbon market, of the environmental system service market, because if we look at it historically, this is the first time that really the economically, we are internalizing the externalities and the positive externalities of, for example, the forest. And that's a big moment. And even so, there are a lot of people criticizing that this is not working, or we have to make it work. And of course, initially, if something starts, there are always pirates coming up and people doing this and that. And projects need to learn, and the economy needs to learn. When we started to melt iron, this was also not perfect, right? So everything we start, we need to give it a time. Um, so the economic effect of this are for us very important. In our model, what we are doing is we are pre-selling the carbon over the first 18 years. We are a social enterprise with our mission is to create what we call like in biological infrastructure, natural infrastructure for humans for on this planet for eternity, if you want to. That's our goal. That's where we measure ourselves. How much forest can we create? So the first 18 years are cash negative, but because I'm pre-selling the carbon, the company's paying for the biological assets. So our investors are investing into the land, but the prices have been rising, and we will be able to sell to basically make the full cash flow the initial 18 years. In the 18 years, what we do is a very, very small commercial thinning just to get us into the year 22, 23, 24. It's always varying a little bit, right? Depending on the species, composition, etc. And so the forest starts to pay for itself. And the model is carbon optimized, which means that we have relatively low thinnings until the year 35. And in the year 35, our carbon project finishes. So companies want the carbon to come earlier. So we created a system where they get more carbon earlier. And in the year 35, formerly it was 44 years. Now it's 35 years, it stops. Then we will have thinnings, continuous thinnings, which will pay back all the invested amounts. And then from then on, we go into a permanent phase. So different to a plantation. And again, I appreciate what humans have done with the plantations. These are fantastic production systems, highly productive, highly almost industrialized, but there are no forests, right? So
Yeah.
this is agriculture with lignium. So this is,
Yeah.
and so what we do is we sell the timber, and in a plantation, I have a final harvest. And then theoretically, I could replant, which means that all my planted trees are under full sunlight. In the
Yeah.
case of the generation forest, that's not the case. That's an economical disadvantage, if you want so. And that's why it's called generation forest. We have different strata. When there is a thinning, we replant, or nature replants. And as we go on, we thin, we replant, we thin, we replant. So we have a multi-species,
Yeah.
multi-strata forest
Yeah.
going into the permanent phase. And in the permanent phase, what we do is, what do you think this forest will have an increase cubic meter per year in this of the timber? How much would you say this is? How many cubic meters you would say per hectare per year in the
Per year.
Yes,
Um,
big trees out
I would, so the increase per year,
there. Mhm.
so maybe between 15, 25?
So we calculate only 8,
Okay.
and we only calculate to take out 6 of that. So we have a biomass increase.
Yeah.
Actually, you know why it's not so high? It's actually not so high because only the big trees, and then we have a lot of them under with no or
And
little
understood.
sunlight, they grow less. That's the difference between the monoculture plantation, right?
Yeah.
But it could be 10 or 12 actually as well,
Yeah.
depending on the species and of course on the site, microsite conditions, etc. But to be on the conservative side, we calculate with 8, and we calculate extracting 8 cubic meter. So 8 cubic meter of this fine tropical timber for today money gets you $200 per cubic meter net out of after harvesting, transport to a port cost. So potentially more, but let's just calculate with this 200 um, uh, cubic meter, $200 per
Yeah,
cubic meter
per cubic.
times 6 as 5 to 6 cubic meter gets you around $1,000 to $1,200 net profit per hectare.
Mhm.
And now
Great year.
there is this economical term of highest and best use that's often used in the real estate world, where we can use it as well, right? So what is actually the best economical activity for a certain geographical condition? And we believe that a generation forest is like strongly the best.
It
What,
really outcompetes other models in that area.
for example, if I look at cattle farmers today, they all make less than $100 per hectare in these
Wow.
areas.
Yeah.
So I'm at least 10 times better than the existing.
Yeah.
And of course, it takes 25, 30 years to come
Yeah.
to this point of
Yeah.
permanence.
You have a high investment in the beginning, right? Planting, maintaining, establishing. So there's like a finance gap in the beginning that you then overcome with the carbon credits. But then if the system is once running, it sounds really that it makes sense, because you also have different tree species like teak, mahogany, and others, which also mature at different points in time. So it's not that you just have one point where you can harvest. So you go over to kind of selective logging regime. Then you have natural regrowth, and then maybe you interplant some more valuable timber tree species that have a high yield, right?
Exactly. You described it. Next
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, well, so I think we outlined the model, and I cannot exactly recall where you said it. Maybe we discussed about you called it like an open source concept, and you said, which I found quite generous to, and you hope it gets copied across the globe. If an organization, let's say in Southeast Asia, Congo Basin, want to replicate your model, what are the biggest barriers they would face? Is it securing the land, finding forestry expert, or
Yeah.
is it getting the capital? What are your assumptions? I just want to, let's say, reveal a little bit, inspire the idea to replicate your model also in other locations, maybe also
Well,
with your support.
our investors know that they did not invest into the IP because the IP is public domain. Everybody, it's open source. We are not in times of holding things back, right? We need to accelerate these processes. And what is the main challenge for each of these other potential sites or actors? I cannot say. There, as you know, there are so many. What we don't want to be a limiting factor is that they don't know the best forest system. But of course, for example, once you understand how the generation forest works, you need to identify local species.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think there is a call for much more aggressive investment into silvicultural research. Right?
Hmm.
There is a lot of research on ecological things.
Yeah.
But I would say we all, and it's great that we continue to do basic science and to get to understand more and more and more of the ecosystem. I'm not against this,
Yeah.
but we
Yeah,
need all.
maybe let me bring in one thing is, when we speak about forests in Europe, we have like 5, 6, 7 species that are economically usable. So in the tropics, I don't know, you already plant like 30 different species, something like, or but there are around three. You mentioned 3,000 different species only in Panama, where no one maybe really knows what's the commercial potential, what is a potential market for these timbers, and each timber species has different properties, right? So
Right.
one are perfect for furniture, for surface, for mechanics, for building canoes, whatever. So each timber has a very specific properties, and So in the tropics, I usually see eucalyptus, Pinus radiata, just or Acacia mangium, but you're already a pioneer in doing some research with Smithsonian Institute. With your wife Ilyana did it, and also the experience of the past 30 years. And I think there's also a big treasure to tap in. So it's not just it's the pharmacy that could look for new ingredients. It's also the industry can look into using some of these species in a maybe exciting new way, right?
For sure. I think also non-timber forest products is a very interesting
Uh,
field, of course,
Right.
but it's not easy, right? There are people often much too romantic about this. Oh, I find this whatever nut, and then the nut looks really good and smells and tastes good, and then they say, okay, we can process your nut and send us a container per week, and then you say, well, I was thinking about a container per year, right? So there are so many barriers. It's not easy, but all these things, what they need, I think, you know, what I found so fascinating in forestry is if we do nature-like forestry and permanent forest, we create such an incredible potential, right? It's not only about conserving something out of the past, it's also creating an enormous potential for the future. But what
Right.
we need is, of course, more public attention, more funding for research, and research not only in the northern country. I'm totally fine with that we have research here in Germany, excellent research, but also what about increasing the research in the tropics where we have this biodiversity with so much potential we don't even think about what there could all be in this. I give you an example. There's this famous Maya nut, right? The Mayans have used this nut. It's called berba in Panama, or hoche in Central America, and ramon in Mexico. This is fantastic. Nobody looked at it, and you know who's looking at it now? Beyond Meat and Nestle to use it because it has 24% of protein in it, right? So one of the protein richest plants in the world. We have those in the forest. So let's build business model around this. And of course, what we also need, not only more investors, we also need more adventurous investors, right? Where you say, there is a likelihood that this will not work, but we need to go in this direction. And when it doesn't work, then the money generated knowledge. So
Yeah.
I think that's missing.
Yeah. And also, I think if an investor invests in the generation forest, there's also the possibility to let's use 10% of the capital to use to try out something new, right? So you know mentioned non-timber forest products like fruits and maybe cocoa or other crops that could be interplanted and could create like an additional revenue. Um, what are your assumptions, or how do you see other financing instruments currently evolving? So many people now start to speak about biodiversity credits. Maybe there's a way to get finance through water protection. So there are areas where even in Germany, where forests are immense, important because they are like a sponge that could keep water during the year to supply the villages, cities, whatever with water or prevent floods. So, what is your feeling regarding these potential new financial instruments?
Well, there is an organization in Germany I heard about called Biodiversity Bridge, which has this idea of bridging between science. Because if we look at science, you and I and people in our field, we know what kind of potential we have there, right? But then how can I get science into the people who take decisions, into management, into towards politicians? So I think we often believe, okay, this is policy, this is how much environmental system services are required is a regulatory issue, right? We know that it is not only a regulatory issue, but and then we often discharge this towards politicians. It's not our deal. No, it's our deal. We have to look, how can we incorporate. And we have an alliance now with regenerative uh, travel agency, and we want to bring people who take the decisions on these things into the forest, because once you are into the forest, then you understand much better. So I think, yes, it's politically, yes, but it is not something we say, oh, we are the forest people, we don't have anything to do with it. No, we can influence and need to influence policy makers and decision takers in, because these markets you mentioned, they only will come together if there's a regulatory framework for it. And
Right.
Panama has been very advanced in this. I have to say, we are now in conversation with the Panama Canal authorities,
Mhm.
evaluating in which way they could pay our forest for getting water into the Panama Canal, right? So,
Yeah.
um, and I believe that the future is definitely there, and the economics of forest are already changed forever, right? So we are, and something really interesting is the market recognizes quality here. So we are selling our carbon certificates at $35 right now on the spot market. And why they pay so much more is because we have all the positive impacts, social and
Right.
environmental impacts.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to look at. And as more you're environmental friendly in your project, and as more you treat your people well, as more the market recognizes this as kind of a shield against PR liability of badly managed project. You don't want to be as a whatever German telecom buying carbon certificate and then get problems with the press because one of your project would you spend money to into was not
Yeah.
doing well.
Yeah. Andreas, we slowly come to a close. You've been working now for 30 years in Panama, and there's no scandal that has come up to, let's say, throw you out of the country, or that there there are, let's say, labor riots around your project. But I want to ask a quite sensitive question. So we have spoken, yeah, really positive about your model, and I really want to understand what makes also the, let's say, the ethical difference, because yeah, how do you ensure that your work, which really relies on the local communities and land, isn't perceived as a new form of colonialism? So exploiting cheap labor and land prices. So
Mm. Um, I think we need to, I mean, there are several answers to this question. One is, of course, as an impact company, we are highly observed. We are a B Corp, so we have a B Corp assessment we do, which looks at more things than FSC does. We just the FSC, we were just again FSC certified, so we were the first company being FSC certified, and I really believe in the process behind FSC with all the challenges the FSC has. It's a wonderful example how like we can organize control mechanism on companies, and also it's a control mechanism, but it's also something which pushes you to improve. And for example, we have no major suck now, no major change, and several times now we got this without a major
yeah,
suck, which is an indicator. So, and the point is just the willingness, right? So, the part of the imperialist, I mean, our company is backed by local and international group of impact
yeah,
investors.
yeah,
And so the question is that an imperialistic thing if a group of national and international investors invest into a country and buy the land from people who have a big problem because the business model extensive cattle farming is dead, they cannot go nowhere, and they actually cannot sell the land to nobody, so it's pretty difficult to do. um,
yeah,
I Where I do have a problem is if I see uh, natural regeneration projects which do not create a lot of labor needs locally.
yeah.
So I think a production forest is the best forest to be protected.
Right. Yeah. It's
Also, the carbon in it is protected, right? So because it's an everyday people are in the forest. This is a protected forest forever, as it is a production forest. Natural
Yeah.
regeneration projects always will face the problem that locals will cut it down to plant yucca again.
Yeah. No, I think for me this sounds very logical. Also, when you described in the beginning of our conversation today that if there's a fire, the local community will warn you early because they feel connected with the project. And let's say collaborating and developing jointly a sustainable forest is, I would say, something really wonderful, but it has to include the local communities. And I think that's what I see here with the generation forest.
Well, one
It's
very simple
also
thing
in the
we did
name.
is simple thing we did is that a certain percentage of our shares when we created the company, 10% of the shares once we created it, is now being distributed between our workers. So they are participating in the company. So what else
Great.
can you do?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, Andreas, thank you so much for the time and these deep insights. And I hope some listeners from the financial space or also other project developers carefully listening and learn from this. Um, my final question is, what gives you hope that we can scale these kind of trustworthy nature-based solutions?
I think we need to be patient, and things will go wrong here and there always, right? And we will learn now this whole discussion about this natural regeneration project. I think we will soon understand that all the learnings from the decades of protecting forest is requires that this forest is also right not on directly as at the service of the local communities. There is no way around this, right? So I think also local communities start now. Our workers take the idea back to their villages and start their own small projects.
So
And
nice. Yeah.
what gives me hope is that w- we know what we have to do, right? There's not a big question of what we have to do. And the biggest issue is, of course, the society has to allocate considerably higher resources to these activities, right? If not, we will not make it. That's pretty clear.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a joint decision.
And it's
Is
good
there
business.
anything
So
Yeah,
shouldn't you do it if it's good business, right? So
yeah. Is there anything you want to share with the audience?
I want to share with the audience that I see beautiful, especially a lot of young people doing a lot of things, and I want to thank everybody who is putting their piece to this beautiful work to restore the world, to heal the wounds we have put onto this earth, and enable a long term future and a harmonic um, life here between humans and nature.
Yeah. And finally, how can listeners connect with you?
Uh, I hope you can. I mean, you can put my email down there. The old
We will put it into the show notes. Yeah.
into the show notes. People
Yeah.
can become members of our cooperative, because that's maybe the last one. Last thing is that this forest investment is always big money, right? So big people, big investments, and so we created the Generation Forest Cooperative, where people for less than $2,000 can become a forest investor and a
Great.
co-owner of a beautiful generation forest in Panama. So I invite everybody to look at this. And people with very little funds, they can even pay just like $30 a month for 4 years with no interest to come on board.
Yeah.
But that was a commercial now at the end.
Yeah, it's important. So, as you mentioned, part of the sustainability game is also get money sustainably flowing into a forest. So I think we can easily solve the ecological and social problems if there's sufficient finance going in this field. Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas. To our listeners, I try to summarize it. Transparency and a holistic long-term vision are what build trust and attractive investments. And that's how we can scale high-quality nature-based projects. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. where we'll continue to explore game-changing approaches for a more sustainable future. Have a great day. Goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.